If you enjoy realistic, dark stories full of twists and turns, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigations. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to know how far these stories are going. The fortress stood isolated in the mountains of Colorado, on the forgotten outskirts of a small town near the old 19th century mining routes. It wasn't a medieval castle nor a historic mansion. It was a brutalist reinforced concrete structure surrounded by high walls, barbed wire, and cameras positioned with military precision. No sign indicated private ownership. No name was registered in the mailbox. Just a solid steel gate that rarely opened. The locals simply called the place the Fortress. Officially, the property belonged to a technology entrepreneur named Arthur Hale, a name that occasionally appeared in financial magazines, always associated with discreet investments in cybersecurity and government contracts. He never gave interviews, he never appeared at public events in the area, and according to City Hall records, he was almost never there, but someone was there. Clara Bennett had moved to the city 6 months earlier, seeking silence after a controversial dismissal from a major investigative newspaper in Denver. Her last article, never published, involved disappearances linked to private security firms with federal contracts. The piece had been censored. Days later, she was fired. The move to that city was no accident. She knew that Arthur Hale had connections with one of those companies. Clara rented a small wooden house a little over 2 kilometers from the fortress. From the back porch, she could see, in the distance, the straight line of the grey walls cutting across the landscape. During the first few weeks, nothing happened. Then the noises began. Unmarked trucks passed along the dirt road only at night. Always between 2 and 4 in the morning. They weren't frequent enough to attract immediate attention, but too regular to be a coincidence. They carried no logos, they didn't make excessive noise, and they never stayed on the property for more than 20 minutes. One early morning, Clara decided to follow one of them. He kept his headlights off and maintained a safe distance. The truck stopped in front of the steel gate. There was no visible intercom. There was no identification. The gate simply opened. She expected to see armed security guards, flashlights, some kind of ostentatious protocol. But there was no one in sight, just cameras slowly rotating. The truck drove in. The gate closed, and then something that wasn't in the plans. A second inner gate, visible only when the first one opened. A double structure, layers of containment. That wasn't just property security, it was isolation. Days later, Clara began investigating the city's public records. She discovered that the construction of the fortress had been approved under the guise of a technological storage center, but the documents were vague. No sanitary inspection, no detailed environmental survey, and, strangely, no formally registered employee working there. Meanwhile, the city was busy discussing other events. 3 people had disappeared in the last 2 years. 2 men who worked as freelance technicians, and a woman who had been temporarily hired for administrative services by a third-party company linked to Hale. Local police treated the cases as voluntary disappearances. Clara didn't believe in coincidences. She began observing the fortress with binoculars, recording times, vehicle frequency, and lighting patterns. She noticed that certain windows on the 2nd level remained illuminated throughout the night. Not with ordinary light, it was a cold, white, almost hospital-like light. One night, something changed. A sharp, brief sound cut through the silence of the mountain. It wasn't wind, it wasn't an animal, it was human, a scream too short to resonate, too long to be mere imagination. Clara froze. The sound was clearly coming from the direction of the fortress. The next day, 2 black cars parked on the city's only commercial street. Men in suits entered the police station. They stayed there for almost 3 hours. At night, the lights of the fortress remained on until dawn. Clara realized she was being watched when she found recent tire tracks near her house. They weren't hers, nor the owner's. Someone had parked there in the early morning and stayed long enough to keep watch. She could leave. But he didn't leave. Instead, he did something riskier. He sent an encrypted email to a former colleague in Denver, mentioning Arthur Hale's name, the disappearances, and the exact location of the property. If something happened to her, there would be a record of it. During the third week of intensive observation, Clara witnessed something that confirmed her suspicions. At 3:17 a.m., a truck unlike the previous ones entered the fortress, longer, refrigerated. When the gate opened for a fraction of a second, the interior was illuminated by the headlights. She saw stretchers, no boxes, stretchers, and someone lying on one of them. The gate closed before I could be sure, but she knew what she had seen. That was not a technology storage center, and whatever was happening inside that private fortress in the United States wasn't just illegal. He was systematic, and someone was quietly funding it. Clara turned off the recorder, took a deep breath, and made a decision that would change the course of the investigation, and possibly her own survival. She needed to go in. The town of Silver Ridge didn't appear on any Colorado tourist maps. It emerged at the height of the 19th century gold rush and survived the mine's collapse by reinventing itself as a discreet haven for retirees and investors seeking privacy. Wooden houses preserved old facades, while historical plaques reminded rare visitors that there had once been dynamite, sweat, and blood there. It was the kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately. Clara Bennett already knew this when she arrived. What she didn't know was how solid the collective silence could be, just like the walls of the fortress. At the corner cafe, frequented by farmers and truck drivers, conversations ceased whenever she mentioned Arthur Hale. Some claimed never to have seen him. Others said he helped the local economy. The town hall had in fact received generous donations in recent years. The school had been renovated, the main road paved, and the medical clinic equipped with new equipment. Officially, Hale's property was merely a private technological research center. Unofficially, nobody was asking questions. The local sheriff, Daniel Crowley, was a man in his 50s, with a firm posture and weary eyes. A former soldier, a veteran of Afghanistan, he had returned to his hometown after 2 decades of service. He maintained order with discreet efficiency. He did not tolerate vandalism. He did not tolerate drug trafficking, and, curiously, he never showed any real interest in the area surrounding the fortress. Clara realized this when she requested access to the disappearance reports. "Adults can leave whenever they want," he replied without raising his voice. "There's no evidence of a crime." But there was something in the way he closed the folder too quickly that indicated more than indifference. It was caution. Investigating business records, Clara discovered that Arthur Hale did not operate alone. His main company, Hale Strategic Systems, had contracts with federal agencies related to defense and data security. The company's name appeared associated with biotechnology containment programs and the storage of sensitive materials. No formal charges, no proven wrongdoing. But the fortress didn't look like a simple warehouse. She began mapping the chain of outsourcing companies linked to the property. One of them was Northbridge Logistics, responsible for overnight transportation. Another was Sentinel Facilities Management, in charge of internal maintenance. It was through Sentinel that Elena Ruiz's name came up. Elena had been hired as a temporary administrative assistant. She had moved from New Mexico to work for 3 months. She disappeared 6 weeks after the start of her contract. Her mother had filed a police report. The case was transferred to state authorities. Later, it was closed due to lack of evidence. Clara managed to contact her mother by phone. The woman's voice trembled as she described her daughter's last call. She said she couldn't talk much, that she had signed something about confidentiality. She seemed scared. Then the call dropped. There was no further contact. While gathering information, Clara began to notice another frequent character in the city, Marcus Doyle. He managed the only 24-hour gas station on the highway leading to the fortress. Truckers from Northbridge would stop there before their nightly deliveries. Marcus was observant. He spoke little, but he didn't seem comfortable with the recent developments. One night, Clara parked at the gas station shortly after 2 in the morning. One of the refrigerated trucks was refueling. The driver avoided eye contact. He was wearing a uniform without any identifying marks. He paid in cash. When he left, Marcus approached discreetly. "You're messing with something too big," he said, without looking directly at her. She didn't answer immediately. "Have you seen what they unload?" he asked. Marcus hesitated. "I've heard things before." He recounted that on 2 occasions, truck drivers had returned pale and trembling. One of them had resigned the next day. The other simply never showed up again. Northbridge alleged breach of contract. Clara began to realize that the fear in the city wasn't just a figment of the imagination, it was maintained by economic dependence. Hale financed projects. He employed indirect workers. He secured public contracts. Questioning the fortress meant threatening the stability of Silver Ridge. Meanwhile, within the concrete walls, another unseen character was shaping events. Dr. Victor Lang. Clara had found the name while tracking down old academic publications. Lang had been a researcher in applied neurobiology, focusing on human resilience to extreme environments. His studies involved sensory deprivation and cognitive adaptation under prolonged isolation. He had disappeared from academia 5 years ago. The last public record of research funding linked his name to a subsidiary of Hale Strategic Systems. The connection was too clear to ignore. If Lang were at the fortress, what they would be researching there wouldn't just involve storage technology. It would involve people. The following week, Clara noticed a change in the fortress's pattern. The flow of trucks decreased. In compensation, drones began to fly over the surrounding area more frequently. She also began to notice a grey car occasionally parked near her house. Never the same driver was ever seen. Always tinted windows. Someone was monitoring his movements. The city's isolation began to weigh differently. It was no longer just scenery. It was a mechanism of control. Limited roads, unstable cell phone signal in the mountains, police station with scarce resources, financial dependence on a single investor. Everything favored silence, but there were cracks. Marcus, at the gas station, began discreetly noting the truck's schedules. A retired teacher from the local school mentioned that the school's renovation had been contingent on a confidentiality agreement that was never publicly explained. And a nurse from the clinic commented, anonymously, that 2 men from the fortress had obtained large quantities of sedatives, claiming they were for veterinary use. The network of small pieces of information began to form a pattern. Something was being kept, contained within those walls. Something that required sedation, overnight transport, and absolute secrecy. Clara organized the data on a makeshift board on the living room wall. Names, companies, dates, times. In the center, an enlarged photograph of the fortress. She was no longer just investigating a building. I was confronting a system carefully structured to operate on the fringes of public visibility, protected by federal contracts, economic dependence, and fear. And the deeper she delved, the clearer a disturbing possibility became. The disappearances were not accidents, and perhaps they weren't the only ones. Clara knew that simply observing was no longer enough. For weeks, she had been piecing together loose ends, obscure contracts, poorly investigated disappearances, refrigerated trucks arriving in the early hours of the morning, sedatives purchased in large quantities. Now, she needed something concrete, something that couldn't be denied. The opportunity arose unexpectedly. Marcus appeared at his house shortly before dawn, his face pale and his hands trembling. He didn't go inside. He spoke from the balcony. "One of them came back," he said quietly. "The driver who disappeared last month. He's in the hospital in the next town." Clara felt her pulse quicken. The man's name was Ethan Cole. Officially, he had quit his job. Unofficially, nobody knew what had happened. According to Marcus, he was found wandering disoriented by the side of the state highway, almost 40 kilometers from Silver Ridge. No documents, no cell phone, with deep scars on his wrists. Clara got in the car immediately. The hospital was located in a larger city, outside of Hale's direct influence. When she gained access to the room, Ethan was sedated, but conscious enough to react to her presence. His eyes took a while to focus. "They said it was medical supplies," he murmured, his voice gruff. "It wasn't." She brought the recorder closer but didn't display it openly. "What did you see?" Ethan hesitated. He looked at the door. The nurse had left. "People were awake," he whispered. "They weren't dead. They weren't sleeping. They were trapped." He closed his eyes, as if the memory caused him physical pain. "They are kept in white rooms, without windows, with light on all the time." Some scream. Others stopped talking after a while. Clara felt her stomach churn. "Why did you leave?" A heavy silence settled in. "Because I left a door open." She didn't need to ask anymore. Before he could continue, two men in suits appeared in the hallway. They weren't wearing hospital identification, just a rigid posture and a calculated look. Clara left before being approached. On her way back to Silver Ridge, she noticed she was being followed by a black SUV. She maintained a steady speed without frequently looking back. She only breathed a sigh of relief when she pulled into her garage and the vehicle drove straight past. From that moment on, the conflict ceased to be theoretical. She now had testimony. That night, the fortress operated at an unusual pace. 3 trucks entered in quick succession. The lights on the second level remained on until dawn. Clara decided to take action. Using a drone equipped with a thermal camera purchased months earlier for another investigation, she launched it from the hillside behind her house. She maintained a low altitude, taking advantage of the mountain's uneven topography to avoid immediate detection. The thermal image revealed something that the concrete was hiding. There were multiple heat signatures underground, more than ordinary employees would justify. Some areas showed repetitive patterns, parallel, organized rows, like compartments. While adjusting the focus, the signal began to fail. Interference. It was no coincidence. The fortress had frequency jammers. The drone lost altitude abruptly and crashed within the inner perimeter. Clara stood motionless before the blank screen. Now they knew. Less than 20 minutes later, the grey car parked in front of his house. This time, it didn't stay far away. A man came downstairs. He was not visibly armed. He knocked on the door with controlled calm. She opened it. "Miss Bennett," he said with a slight smile, "Mr. Arthur Hale would like to speak with you." It wasn't a formal invitation. It was a summons. Inside the fortress, Clara saw the interior for the first time. The first gate slammed shut behind her with a dry metallic sound. The second only opened after facial scanning and biometric verification of the driver. There were no visible windows in the main corridor, only polished concrete and constant white lighting. The air smelled far too sterile for a typical storage facility. Arthur Hale waited in a spacious, minimalist room. Dark suit, relaxed posture, gaze too attentive to be casual. "Curiosity is an admirable quality," he said even before she could speak. "But it's also dangerous." Clara didn't sit down. "How many people are in here?" He showed no surprise. "This is a private research facility. Completely legal. People are being held against their will." A brief silence. "Volunteers participate in psychological resilience programs. They sign contracts. They are well paid. And when do you want to leave?" His gaze hardened for a fraction of a second. Not everyone copes well with adaptation processes. He walked up to a darkened glass wall and touched a panel. The glass became transparent. On the other side, a white room. A man sitting in a metal chair, intense light on him. No windows, no clock. The man blinked slowly, as if time had lost its meaning. "We are developing protocols that can save lives," Hale said. "Captured soldiers, hostages, astronauts in prolonged isolation. The real world is not kind, Miss Bennett." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Did they agree to this? Hale stared at her. Consent is a flexible concept when national security is at stake. Before she could answer, a discreet alarm sounded in the hallway. A technician rushed in, whispering something in Hale's ear. For the first time, he seemed irritated. It seems that one of the participants had an unexpected reaction. Clara heard a distant scream. This time, it was prolonged. Hale turned to her. "You came here of your own free will. That shows courage, but also recklessness." Two security guards positioned themselves discreetly near the door. "You can't keep me here," Clara said. He smiled, almost imperceptibly. "I don't need to." He made a subtle gesture. The door opened. "Go home, and think carefully about what you'll do next." Silver Ridge depends on this facility. The city thrives because of it. The threat was not physical, it was structural. When Clara left the fortress, she realized the conflict had escalated beyond a simple journalistic investigation. It now involved federal contracts, human experimentation, and an entire city held together by silence. And for the first time, she understood something even more disturbing. Hale didn't seem like a man who believed he was committing a crime. He believed he was doing something necessary, which made everything even more dangerous. Clara didn't return home immediately after leaving the fortress. She drove aimlessly along the winding mountain roads of Colorado, trying to gather her thoughts. What she had seen wasn't speculation. It was reality. People were being kept in extreme isolation under the guise of national security research. But there was a bigger problem than the exam itself. Silver Ridge depended on the fortress. The next day, the tension in the city was palpable. Two new vehicles from Hale Strategic Systems were parked near City Hall. The rumor circulated quietly. There would be a new investment, perhaps an expansion of the facility. More indirect jobs, more money circulating. Clara realized that if she denounced this abruptly, she would not only be confronting Arthur Hale, she would be confronting the city itself. This was the first subplot that began to close in on her. The collective loyalty built on economic benefit. Meanwhile, Marcus Doyle was facing his own conflict. The gas station was his only source of income. He supported his younger sister, who was studying nursing in the state capital. Most of Northbridge's trucks refueled there. If the contract were cancelled, he would lose almost half of his monthly revenue. Nevertheless, he began discreetly sending Clara copies of the cash receipts paid by the drivers. Amounts far too high for simple logistical transport. Another piece began to move when Clara received an encrypted message from her former colleague in Denver. He had confirmed something crucial. Hale Strategic Systems had received indirect funding from an experimental federal program linked to the psychological resilience of captive agents. The program's name was kept secret. But the figures were public. They were too tall for a simple storage center. At the same time, Elena Ruiz's mother decided to come to Silver Ridge in person. The woman arrived determined, with a briefcase full of documents and photos of her daughter. Her presence changed the balance of the town. She was no longer just a curious journalist. She was a mother seeking answers. Sheriff Daniel Crowley tried to maintain a neutral stance, but his discomfort was evident. He began to deliberately avoid Clara, until a new complication arose. Ethan Cole, the driver who had escaped, disappeared from the hospital again. The medical record indicated transfer to a specialized center, no address, no clear medical signature. Clara knew what that meant. Hale was closing loopholes. Time pressure began to mount. If she didn't act quickly, evidence and witnesses would be eliminated under layers of legality and federal secrecy. That same week, an unexpected incident shook the city. A short circuit hit part of the power grid near the fortress during a nighttime storm. The power fluctuated for almost 3 minutes. That was enough. Residents reported hearing alarms coming from the property. Some said they saw flashing red emergency lights on the exterior walls. Marcus, who was at the station, saw something even more unsettling. An unmarked ambulance sped away from the fortress. The following day, the local clinic received an unusual request: urgent shipment of blood bags for emergency veterinary use. The nurse, who had previously commented on the sedatives, confided to Clara that the requested dosage did not correspond to any common animal protocol. Meanwhile, cracks were beginning to appear inside the fortress itself. Clara had received via an anonymous email a single audio file. In it, a male voice, possibly that of a technician, said, "He can't take it anymore. This isn't adaptation, it's a breakdown. Dr. Lang knows this." The direct mention of Dr. Victor Lang confirmed his active presence at the facility. Another subplot emerged: possible internal dissent. Tensions were also rising in the relationship between Clara and Sheriff Crowley. He summoned her to the police station under the pretext of ensuring her safety. "You're messing with federal contracts," he said cautiously. "That's beyond my jurisdiction." "Then who's in charge of monitoring?" she retorted. He didn't answer immediately. Sometimes it's not about oversight, it's about maintaining stability. The word hung heavy in the air: stability. Silver Ridge was thriving for the first time in decades. The school had new computers, the clinic had modern equipment. The main road had finally been paved. If the fortress were closed, all of that could disappear. Clara began to realize that Hale had built more than just a research center. He had created structural dependency, an ecosystem where questioning meant risking the collective livelihood. But time was running out. The night after the blackout, the lights in the fortress never went out. The thermal pattern detected from a distance indicated intensified activity underground. And then something unexpected happened. One of the outer walls showed a visible crack, small but recent, probably the result of electrical fluctuations that had affected the internal environmental control systems. Steam was discreetly escaping from one of the side vents. Clara realized that this could be the physical opening she needed, but at the same time, more alarming information arrived via an anonymous message. "They will transfer the participants. 2 days." If that were true, the entire system could be dismantled before any allegations gained traction. As subtraumas convergium, Elena's mother is publicly pressing for answers. Marcus is risking his own livelihood by collaborating, a potential insider questioning the methods of just. The sheriff is torn between legal duty and economic stability, the imminent transfer of the prisoners. The time pressure was now concrete. Clara was less than 48 hours old. If he wanted irrefutable proof, he would have to act before the fortress became just another empty structure in the middle of the mountains, clean, legalized, and without any trace of human presence. And for the first time since the start of the investigation, she noticed something disturbing. Perhaps he wasn't just trying to expose a crime. Perhaps he was trying to prevent something far worse from being taken elsewhere. The warning was clear: 2 days. Clara didn't sleep that night. If the participants were transferred, any chance of exposing what was happening inside the fortress would disappear under layers of federal secrecy. Ethan had already been taken. Elena remained missing, and the recent blackout had shown that the system was not infallible. The crack in the outer wall could be the only physical opportunity for access. But it wasn't just a matter of getting in, it was about leaving with evidence. The following morning, The city was summoned to an emergency meeting at City Hall. Arthur Hale attended in person. His presence was rare and strategic. He announced the expansion of the facility, new indirect jobs, additional investments in the clinic, an educational fund for local students. Subdued applause echoed through the hall. Clara watched from the back of the room. Hale spoke of progress, federal partnerships, and national security. No mention of human searches. Not a word about disappearances. At the end of the speech, he did something unexpected. "We also need to combat misinformation," he said, looking directly at Clara. "Rumors can harm an entire community." There was no direct accusation, but the message had been delivered. That night, Marcus showed up again. "2 trucks will arrive tomorrow at 3, he said. "Refrigerated. Different escort this time. Transfer." Clara knew she couldn't wait for state authorities or the national press. The federal connection would shield everything before any formal investigation could move forward. She made the decision. He would come in during the transfer. Wearing dark clothes and taking advantage of the area of the fissure observed days before, Clara approached the fortress shortly before 2 in the morning. The air was colder than usual. Steam still escaped discreetly from a side opening, probably connected to the basement ventilation system. With effort and cuts on his hands, he managed to force his way through the weak point. The interior was even more oppressive at night. White corridors, constant lighting, controlled silence. Silent alarms seemed integrated into the very air. She followed the mental map she had created after her previous visit. She went down 2 levels to the basement. It was there that the turning point became apparent. The isolation rooms were open, empty. Abandoned metal chairs. Marks on the floor indicating that stretchers had been hastily removed, but not all of them had been taken. In one of the side rooms, she found someone. A woman sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, her wrists marked by restraints. Her gaze was fixed on the light above, but she reacted slowly when Clara approached. "Elena?" Clara ventured. The woman blinked several times, as if trying to reorganize her own perception. "They said I failed," he murmured. Clara's heart raced. Elena Ruiz was alive. Before he could help her, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Clara pulled Elena behind a metal counter. 2 technicians hurried past, arguing. Lang did not authorize leaving anyone behind. "She can't handle the transfer." Hale decided to terminate it. "Close, do not transfer." Clara understood at that moment that the plan wasn't just about moving the participants, it was about eliminating traces. The sound of a low alarm began to vibrate through the basement. Not shrill, internal, controlled. They had detected an intrusion. She tried to lift Elena, but the woman could barely support her own weight. The weeks, perhaps months, of sensory deprivation had compromised her coordination. Then something even more unexpected happened. The lights flickered, a second power outage, more intense than the first. For a few seconds, the corridor was plunged into partial darkness, illuminated only by red emergency lights. And in the midst of that controlled chaos, a figure emerged in the opposite corridor. Dr. Victor Lang. He didn't seem like a hysterical villain. He wasn't shouting orders. He observed the portable monitors with clinical coldness. Their eyes met. There were no surprises. "You don't understand what you're interrupting," he said calmly. She didn't answer. They signed. They knew the risks. "Indefinite isolation is not a risk. It's destruction," she retorted. Lang tilted his head slightly. "The world out there demands extreme resilience. We are preparing people for the worst possible scenario. Preparing or breaking." For a moment, his gaze wavered, and then came the revelation that would change everything. "They're not all volunteers," he said, almost as an involuntary confession. "Some are referred." Clara felt like she couldn't breathe. Referred by whom? Lang did not respond, but within that silence lay the truth. The program wasn't just private. There was official cooperation. The alarm grew louder. Security guards were approaching. Lang took a step back. "If you leave here with her, you'll destroy years of research," he said. "If I don't leave, I destroy any chance of justice." The decision was immediate. Clara pulled Elena down the side corridor as the power flickered again. Automatic doors jammed partially. The system was unstable. When they reached the area near the outer fissure, the first truck had already arrived at the main yard. Uniformed men were unloading medical equipment, not stretchers with people. The plan had changed. They were dismantling the operation. With almost unbearable effort, Clara managed to push Eleanor through the opening in the wall. An outside siren began to sound. Spotlights swept across the hillside. They ran through the uneven vegetation, stumbling over stones and branches. No shots were fired. The persecution was not immediate, and that was even more unsettling. When they finally reached the back road, Clara realized that something bigger was at stake. Hale had not tried to stop her directly. Lang had not used lethal force. The operation was being concluded far too quickly. The real turning point wasn't just Elena's rescue. It was the understanding that the fortress was not the end of the project. It was just a prototype. And now, with the floor exposed, the experiment could be moved to an even more inconspicuous location. As Clara helped Elena into the car, she glanced back. The lights in the fortress began to go out, sector by sector, not like a collapse, but as a planned ending. The sun had not yet risen when Clara parked the car behind an abandoned barn a few miles from Silver Ridge. Eleanor was conscious, but her breathing was uneven, and her eyes were slow to focus on anything other than the nearest light. The deprivation had left visible marks, excessively pale skin, imprecise movements, lapses in orientation. "They took the clock. There was no night," Elena murmured with difficulty. "The light never went out." Clara recorded every word. Before making any other decisions, he took Elena directly to the neighboring town, not to the local clinic. He no longer trusted Hale's network of indirect influence. Meanwhile, Silver Ridge awoke under a strangely silent atmosphere. At 8 in the morning, trucks left the fortress in an organized convoy. They carried no visible people, only sealed equipment, servers, and metal boxes. Marcus sent a short message. "They are emptying everything." The dismantling was too quick to be improvised. This confirmed what Clara had suspected. The closure was part of a containment protocol. At the police station, Sheriff Crowley received a call that changed his perspective. It wasn't Clara who called. It was Elena's mother. She arrived in the city with her still frail daughter and demanded immediate formal registration of unlawful imprisonment and experimentation. Elena, even in her weakened state, confirmed that she never had any real opportunity to leave the program. Crowley listened to everything in silence. When he finished, he closed the interrogation room door and disconnected the landline phone on the desk. "If this is federal," he said, looking at Clara, "I could lose my badge. If it's not registered now, they'll delete everything," she replied. He remained motionless for a few seconds that seemed longer than the confrontation at the fortress. Then a new official report was filed. It was the first concrete act of institutional rupture. Meanwhile, at the fortress, activity gradually ceased. By early afternoon, only a small group remained. Among them were Arthur Hale and Dr. Victor Lang. Clara received an unexpected call. "Private number. You bought yourself some time," Hale's voice said, cold but not agitated. "But you don't understand the consequences. People were held against their will. People are held against their will every day in military prisons, war zones, and detention centers. The difference is that here we were trying to prepare them to survive. You were testing human limits." A brief silence. "The world is changing faster than you think. Extreme isolation will be a reality for many. We just got there first." The call ended without any direct threat. This worried Clara more than any explicit intimidation. At the hospital in the neighboring city, preliminary tests revealed something even more worrying. Elena presented mild neurological changes consistent with prolonged sensory deprivation. There were indications of continuous use of alternating sedatives and stimulants, a method to prolong resistance without allowing immediate collapse. It wasn't improvisation. It was protocol. Marcus, for his part, was facing the consequences of his own actions. Representatives from Northbridge cancelled the supply contract without formal explanation. The financial impact would be immediate. He knew the reason. Silver Ridge began to silently split apart. Some residents defended Hale, arguing that he had brought prosperity. Others began to question whether the price had been too high. The school received notification of a temporary suspension of the promised educational funding. The clinic was informed that future disbursements would be reassessed. The structural dependency was beginning to reveal its true weight. In the late afternoon, federal vehicles arrived at the fortress. Not with sirens. No show. They went in, stayed for hours, and then left. No public arrests were announced at that time. Clara then realized that the consequence would be neither immediate nor simple. The conflict was no longer local. Now it involved deeper institutional layers. That night she reviewed all the collected material: Ethan's recordings, Elena's testimony, thermal images of the subsoil before the drone crash, and financial records from Hale Strategic Systems. The pattern was clear, but it was also too sensitive to be ignored by the federal government. The biggest consequence, however, wasn't in the documents. It was in the silent transformation of the characters around them. Crowley was no longer just the cautious sheriff. He was now officially involved in a case that could cost him his career. Marcus was not merely an observer. He had sacrificed economic stability on principle. Elena was no longer just a missing person. She had become living proof. And Clara understood something essential. The fortress might be being emptied, but the system that had allowed its existence remained intact. The question was no longer just what happened inside those walls. It was a wonder how many other similar facilities might exist. As the last lights of the fortress finally went out that night, a persistent feeling took shape. They hadn't won. They simply forced a strategic retreat. And that meant the real reaction was yet to come. The fortress was officially deactivated 3 days after Elena's rescue. The final trucks left the site at dawn. Signs were removed. Internal systems dismantled. The concrete remained, but the interior had been emptied with surgical precision. For Silver Ridge, the narrative presented was simple: termination of a federal contract due to strategic restructuring. Nothing about human experimentation, nothing about forced isolation. Clara knew that the real battle was beginning now. Exposing an active facility was one thing. Confronting an operation that had already been dismantled required something different: strategy, patience, and resilience. Elena remained in recovery, under medical and psychological supervision. In the first few days, she could barely stay in dimly lit environments. She only slept with the lights on. The absolute silence made her tremble. But something had changed in her. Instead of shutting down completely, she began to record memories, small notes, descriptions of routines, schedules of light stimulation, voice patterns of the technicians. "If I forget, they win," Clara said with unexpected firmness. Her transformation was slow, but visible. The victim was becoming an active witness. Marcus, for his part, was facing immediate financial difficulties. The gas station was almost empty in the first week after the cancellation of the contract with Northbridge. But something curious happened. Residents began to fill up there by choice, not out of convenience. It wasn't just solidarity, it was about positioning. Sheriff Crowley himself came under pressure. He received visits from state representatives questioning the formal recording of the incident. They asked if he had exaggerated in classifying the case as possible unlawful imprisonment. He responded with something he hadn't said before. "I saw the medical reports." It was no longer just economic stability that guided him. It was responsibility. Clara realized that she needed to evolve as well. Until then, she had worked as a lone researcher. Now, she needed to build a network. He sent the collected material to 3 different newsrooms in distinct states, under agreements for simultaneous publication. One report wasn't enough. He needed to make coordinated silence impossible. He also sought out a civil rights organization specializing in institutional abuses. For the first time, he shared control of the information. It wasn't a loss of prominence, it was strategic protection. Meanwhile, a disturbing detail emerged from the financial records analyzed more closely. Part of the resources allocated to Hale Strategic Systems came from a budget line linked to psychological containment programs for agents in external operations. But the figures far exceeded what was needed for conventional research. Clara began to understand that the project wasn't just about resisting isolation. It was about testing the limits of the human mind under absolute control. And that required more than just reporting the incident. It required technical understanding. She contacted experts in neuroscience and sensory deprivation. She discovered that prolonged periods under constant light and without a sense of time can cause severe cognitive distortions in just a few weeks. Some of the participants had been in the fortress for months. Awareness of this strengthened her resolve, but it also altered her attitude. She stopped acting impulsively and began to anticipate institutional moves. When a lawyer representing Hale tried to intimidate her with threats of a defamation lawsuit, she had already shared documents with multiple entities. The legal risk became less effective. The biggest change, however, occurred internally. Clara stopped acting solely out of indignation. He began to act with calculation. She knew that Hale and Lang genuinely believed they were preparing the country for extreme scenarios. This made the conflict more complex. It wasn't about a caricatured villain, it was about a cold, utilitarian logic. To face it, I needed more than just emotion. I needed irrefutable evidence. Elena, weeks later, did something decisive. He agreed to record a video statement showing the marks on his wrists, describing the deprivation, and explaining how consent was obtained under contractual pressure and with incomplete information. The recording wasn't dramatic. It was necessary. And that made her powerful. Marcus also decided to speak publicly about the pattern of night trucks and cash payments. He knew he could face definite economic retaliation. But his stance changed. "I'd rather lose money than lose sleep," he said, with a firmness he hadn't shown before. The growth wasn't just Clara's. It was a collective effort. Even Crowley, initially focused on the stability of the city, began to push for an independent state audit of the fortress contracts. The protagonist's transformation wasn't about delivering a fiery speech. It was a matter of strategic choices. Clara had learned that confronting power structures requires patience and alliances, that isolated acts of evidence may disappear, but networks make silence impossible. That impulsive courage saves lives in the short term, but organized resistance sustains lasting change. When the first story was finally published nationally, Silver Ridge was no longer isolated. Arthur Hale's name began circulating amidst public scrutiny. Victor Lang's work has reappeared in academic debates, and the fortress, now empty, came under investigation by external authorities. Clara observed the grey concrete for the last time at dusk. There were no more lights on, but the real growth lay in the fact that she was no longer facing it alone. And if the project was being rebuilt elsewhere, as he suspected, this time there would be wider surveillance. Overcoming challenges did not mean complete victory. It meant being prepared for the next stage. The first report aired on a Tuesday morning. 3 news outlets simultaneously published the data: financial records, medical testimonies, Elena Ruiz's recorded testimony, and official confirmation that the Silver Ridge facility operated under an indirect federal contract. The impact was immediate. There were no public arrests that day. There was institutional silence. But the silence was now being observed nationally. In less than 48 hours, an independent commission was announced to review Hale Strategic Systems contracts. Arthur Hale's name ceased to appear only in financial magazines and began circulating in political debates. Clara knew this was just the beginning. She revisited the deactivated fortress with preliminary judicial authorization. The interior was too clean. Staff removed, medical equipment non-existent, rooms sterilized, but small details escaped the complete dismantling. Grooves in the floor where chairs had been permanently fixed, reinforced ventilation openings in the basement, marks from sensors on the walls, nothing incriminating in isolation, but together they formed a pattern. Meanwhile, new information began to emerge. A former employee of Sentinel Facilities Management contacted the civil rights organization supporting Clara. He hadn't worked directly in the isolation rooms, but he confirmed something crucial. The fortress's electrical system had been designed with triple redundancy, specifically to maintain continuous, uninterrupted lighting. Deprivation of time was not a side effect. That was the central objective. The pressure was mounting. Federal representatives visited Silver Ridge for formal interviews. Crowley was called to testify about why he had registered the incident as unlawful imprisonment before any confirmation from a superior. He maintained his position. "There was a victim," he replied. Meanwhile, Arthur Hale maintained a controlled public stance. In an official statement, he declared that the program had been misinterpreted and that all participants had signed informed consent contracts, but a new piece would alter the balance. During her recovery sessions, Elena began to remember something specific, a room different from the others, where some participants were taken after showing signs of psychological breakdown. They didn't go back to the standard classrooms. She remembered a metallic sound, a lower temperature, and a complete absence of human voices. Clara cross-referenced this information with the thermal maps captured before the drone crash. There was an area in the basement with an irregular heat signature, isolated from the others. It did not appear in the architectural records submitted to the City Hall, an undeclared wing. The deadline for the Federal Commission to deliver its preliminary report was set for 5 days later. If that wing formally existed, it needed to be proven before documents could be officially consolidated. Clara pressed for a new, detailed technical inspection of the structure before any sale or demolition process could begin. Surprisingly, Hale did not publicly object. This lack of resistance raised an alarm. He seemed overconfident. Meanwhile, a financial detail went unnoticed by most, but not by Clara. Days before the report was published, a new company had been registered in Nevada, with a board of directors partially linked to former executives of Hale Strategic Systems. Social objective: research in extreme environments. The project was not being terminated. I was being relocated. Tension grew as the commission neared the delivery of its report. If the official narrative classified the case as a legal experiment with minor ethical flaws, everything could be dismissed with contractual adjustments. The undeclared wing became the focal point. During the authorized final inspection, state engineers analyzed the complete structural plan. In the basement, they detected a discrepancy in the thickness of a specific wall, reinforced concrete beyond the standard of the other internal partitions. When they began exploratory drilling, they found something unexpected: hollow space behind the wall, sealed. The news was not yet public, but Clara was informed by Crowley before the Federal Commission had full access to the results. "If there's something in there, it changes everything," he said. The narrative shifted from controversial research to deliberate concealment. While they awaited judicial authorization to fully open the compartment, external pressure mounted. Hale's lawyers attempted to halt the intervention, alleging a violation of private property. The hearing was scheduled for the following morning. The tension was now objective, concrete, and limited in time. If the hidden wing were opened before any legal restrictions were lifted, the case would take on insurmountable criminal proportions. If it were blocked, the project could be classified as terminated and restructured under another name in another state. The night before the hearing, Clara received one last anonymous message. It wasn't resistance they were measuring, it was obedience. The sentence shifted the focus of understanding. Perhaps the goal was never simply to test psychological limits. Perhaps they were assessing how long someone could endure before accepting any command, preparing for captivity or for control. At dawn, technical teams were ready to completely remove the reinforced wall. Arthur Hale personally attended the event. Victor Lang as well. None of them seemed surprised. The wall began to be opened under legal supervision. And as the concrete was removed centimeter by centimeter, the tension reached its peak. Whatever was sealed, they would determine whether Silver Ridge had been the site of a controversial experiment, or something far darker. The sound of the jackhammer echoed through the basement like a constant metallic pulse. Fine dust spread through the white corridor, now filled with technicians, state engineers, federal representatives, and two silent observers, Arthur Hale and Victor Lang. Clara watched everything alongside Sheriff Crowley. With each layer of concrete removed, the tension increased. The wall was thicker than any other internal structure of the fortress. It wasn't ordinary reinforcement, it was a matter of restraint. When they finally made enough room to insert an inspection camera, everyone leaned towards the portable monitor. The initial image showed darkness. Then, a room, smaller than the others, fully lined with insulating material, no fixed lighting, no metal chair. In the center, there is only one module suspended by steel supports, something between a capsule and a vertical containment compartment. The silence in the hallway became absolute. The camera was fully inserted. The module was empty, but the interior walls were covered in irregular marks, scratches, and something more. An audio system embedded in the ceiling, connected to an external panel that is still active. A technician quickly examined the remaining wires. "That wasn't sensory deprivation," he murmured. "It's auditory conditioning." Clara felt her heart race. What it means. He carefully adjusted the system and connected the temporary power. A sound began to fill the room. It wasn't white noise, it was a voice, repetitive, methodical. "You are safe when you obey. You are safe when you obey. You are safe when you obey." The pattern was continuous, with slight variations in intonation and frequency. Clara looked at Lang. For the first time, his expression was not clinical. It was defensive. "This is preparation for extreme interrogations," he said firmly, "to resist psychological manipulation." "That's inducement to submission," Clara replied. The technician continued examining the central module. Inside the capsule were supports for complete body containment, biometric sensors, independent temperature control, total acoustic isolation from the outside, except for the programmed voice. It wasn't just isolation. It was reprogramming. Crowley turned to Hale. This was not in the contracts submitted to the City Hall. Hale maintained a controlled posture. "Advanced research requires confidentiality." "That requires a formal accusation," the sheriff retorted. The final straw came when they found partial records in the internal backup system that had not been completely deleted. Coded names, average exposure time in the capsule, results classified as complete breakdown, 11 days. Partial resistance, 19 days. Stable compliance, 14 days. It wasn't resistance they were measuring. It was a time of great obedience. Elena, who was waiting outside under medical supervision, was called in to listen to the audio. Hearing the repetitive phrase, she began to tremble. "That room," he whispered. "It was for those who questioned the protocol. They said it was the final stage." Human confirmation eliminated any technical ambiguity. The experiment went beyond controversial ethical considerations. It was systematic coercion. The federal representatives present exchanged tense glances. One of them made an immediate phone call. Minutes later, the order was given. Arthur Hale was being formally detained for investigation on charges of kidnapping, aggravated psychological coercion, and concealment of contractual information. Victor Lang tried to argue. "You don't understand the strategic implications of this," he said, raising his voice for the first time. "The world demands soldiers capable of withstanding mental breakdown." Clara stepped forward. "Resisting is not the same as accepting any command in order to survive." Lang stared at her but did not answer. When Hale was led down the corridor that had once symbolized absolute control, the irony was evident. The walls designed to contain others now defined his own freedom. But the real climax wasn't just in prison. It was during the public transformation of the narrative. Faced with the physical evidence of the hidden wing and the records of stable compliance, the Federal Commission could not classify the project as simply poorly conducted research. It was a clandestine experiment in human conditioning. The final twist came a few hours later, when one of the federal agents revealed something additional. The company registered in Nevada was not simply a continuation of the project. It was a backup authorized by a specific division of the government. This meant that Hale had not acted alone. He had been supported. Prison did not shut down the system, but it made it impossible for him to operate in the shadows. Clara watched as the capsule was disassembled piece by piece. The transformation was visible, not just in the research, but within herself. Initially, I was looking for answers about disappearances. Now, he was exposing an entire model of institutionalized psychological control. She was no longer responding. I was guiding the revelation. When he left the fortress that day, the concrete was still there, but the myth of invulnerability had been shattered, and Silver Ridge would never again be just a quiet town in the mountains. Arthur Hale's arrest wasn't televised nationally at the time. There was no immediate spectacle, but in the following weeks, the case took on proportions that went beyond Silver Ridge, Colorado, and even the Fortress project itself. The formal charges were expanded. In addition to kidnapping and psychological coercion, evidence emerged of contractual fraud and deliberate omission of unauthorized experimental protocols. Victor Lang's name began to appear as a co-intellectual author of the auditory conditioning program. But the decisive point came when the Independent Commission released the official report. The document acknowledged that the project had initially been approved as a study of voluntary psychological resistance. However, the existence of the hidden wing, the records of complete breakdown, and the system of repetitive obedience inducement constituted a serious violation of human rights. The language was technical, but the meaning was devastating. Silver Ridge faced weeks of economic uncertainty. Promised investments were suspended. The clinic had to reorganize its budget. The school lost some of its extra funding. Still, something has changed in the city. For the first time in decades, decisions began to be debated publicly. Residents started questioning contracts that had previously been accepted automatically. Silent dependence gave way to collective vigilance. Marcus managed to keep the gas station open, supported by a local campaign that encouraged conscious consumption. The business didn't return to its previous revenue, but it became a symbol of ethical positioning. Sheriff Crowley was called to testify at the state level. Many expected him to be removed from office. Instead, his conduct was praised for formally filing the complaint, while there was still legal uncertainty. He remained in office, now with a strengthened reputation. Elena Ruiz became a key witness in the federal trial. Her testimony was crucial in establishing that the consent obtained was neither fully informed nor revocable. Her recovery was gradual. She still avoided completely dark environments. She still woke up with the feeling that someone was repeating phrases in the silence. But now, when he closed his eyes, he knew that the voice no longer came from a system embedded in concrete. Clara, in turn, published a complete series on the case. Not just the denunciation, but the structural analysis. How federal contracts can create grey areas, how economic dependence silences communities, how technical language can mask coercive practices. She is no longer just an investigative journalist. It has become a benchmark in the oversight of psychological safety programs. Months later, the fortress was officially put up for sale as a decommissioned industrial facility. No buyers came forward immediately. The building remained empty, imposing, and silent in the mountains, but now everyone knew what had happened there. The legal proceedings against Hale and Lang would drag on for years. Further revelations would emerge, including emails that demonstrated pressure for measurable results of behavioral compliance. The project in Nevada was suspended as a precautionary measure following an emergency audit. It was no guarantee that similar initiatives would never reappear. But public exposure had created barriers. The ultimate consequence was not just individual punishment. It was a change in surveillance. Silver Ridge learned that prosperity without question can have an invisible cost. Federal institutions began reviewing research protocols involving sensory deprivation. Civil organizations increased monitoring of classified contracts, and Clara understood something essential as she observed the fortress for the last time at dusk. The danger was never just in the concrete, the walls, or the hidden capsule. It lay in the unspoken justification that certain methods are acceptable for the greater good. She didn't destroy the entire system, but he forced the world to look at him, and sometimes that's enough to stop him from operating in the shadows. A year later, the mountain fortress in Silver Ridge remained empty. The concrete still reflected the cold of winter mornings, and the fog that descended the slopes seemed to embrace the building as if it wanted to hide it once more. The federal property sign had been removed. All that remained was the closed gate and a contact number for interested parties, which no one called. Clara went back there one afternoon in September, not as a journalist searching for evidence, but as someone who needed to close a chapter. She parked a few meters from the gate and remained inside the car for several minutes. There were no more guards. There was no more movement, only wind. The trial against Arthur Hale and Victor Lang continued. Technical hearings, expert reports, appeals. Justice was slow and sometimes too silent. Elena Ruiz had moved to another city. She maintained sporadic contact with Clara. She was in therapy, gradually resuming her career. She still had difficulty with repetitive sounds. She still avoided phrases spoken in a tone that was too neutral, but now she got to choose when to listen and when you leave. Marcus expanded the small market with the help of residents who believed the city needed independent businesses. The sign at the entrance read, "Local commerce, local decisions." Sheriff Crowley began giving lectures at regional meetings about institutional accountability. He never mentioned classified details, but he repeated a phrase that had become almost a motto. Authority is not a substitute for conscience. The fortress, however, remained as a physical reminder of something deeper. It wasn't just a building. It was proof of how structures can be erected with declared good intentions and still harbor questionable practices. Before leaving, Clara got out of the car. He walked to the gate and touched the cold metal with his fingertips. There were no more voices echoing within those walls, but there was memory, and memory, when preserved, prevents repetition. She went back to the car without looking back, not out of fear, but because he knew the real work was no longer there. It was in the next stories. The following contracts should be read carefully, in the following seemingly harmless clauses. As I drove back to town, the sun began to disappear behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. Silver Ridge would never be quite the same, and perhaps that was the best possible outcome. Stories like that of Silver Ridge don't just end with arrests, official reports, or empty buildings. They leave questions unanswered, questions about trust, regarding authority. It's about how far we're willing to go when someone promises security, progress, or prosperity. The fortress was closed, the program was exposed, those responsible faced justice. But the most important element of this story wasn't the downfall of Arthur Hale. It was the decision of a single person not to accept superficial answers. It was Clara who kept insisting when they said there was nothing there. It was Elena speaking when the fear still echoed in her memory. It was a sheriff officially recording something that might have been overlooked. Systems only operate in the shadows when no one turns on the light. And sometimes that light starts small, a question, a suspicion, an investigation. Silver Ridge has learned that prosperity without transparency comes at a price. He learned that complex contracts require careful reading. He learned that institutional silence is not synonymous with innocence. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not what happened inside the fortress, but how many other similar structures exist, sustained only by blind trust. And that's where the story stops being fiction. And it turns into an alert. If you've made it this far, it means this story has touched something deep within you. Tell us in the comments, do you believe that projects like this could exist today in secret? Or do you think that public exposure is already enough to prevent something like this? And also tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has gone. If you enjoy realistic narratives, institutional mysteries, and stories that seem like fiction but could be real, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next investigations. Because sometimes what seems as solid as concrete, it hides invisible cracks, and we still have many doors to open.